With an outlook that projects demand for critical minerals potentially quadrupling by 2040, Europe is facing a number of opposing forces. On one side, continued acceleration in the deployment and ongoing development of renewable technologies and electric vehicles is coming head-on with high downstream cost inflation and the prospect of supply chain constraints, certainly leading to an impact on high dependency on imports. So will we see a step change in spending activity, or will alternative strategies need to be adopted to meet future demand? Welcome to Navigating the Currents of Change. My name is Shaheen Chauhan and I lead global analytics here at Industrial Info Resources. For over 40 years, we have been providing market intelligence, data, and analytic and geospatial solutions to those companies involved in the design, construction, and maintenance of plants and facilities across energy, mining, and heavy industrial sectors across the world. Now, to help me unpick some of the trends we are seeing, I'm delighted to be joined by two of our subject matter experts. Joe Govreau is IIR's Global Head of Metals and Minerals Research, and also in the hot seat is Cemal Mentes, Assistant VP for Metals and Minerals Research in Europe. Welcome, gentlemen. Now, Joe, just to start with you, given the current softer economic outlook for this year, although there has been something of an upgrade to global GDP this year, there still remains, I guess, a lot of pressure on many aspects of the energy transition and certainly different decarbonisation technologies. Now, the big question is, will we see a slowdown or possibly a stall, or will we continue to see momentum and forward movement with many of these decarbonisation and energy transition initiatives and certainly the associated spending? And what kind of impact will that have on upstream mining activity, but also in that very important segment in Europe, the downstream smelting?
Yeah, interesting times indeed, Shaheen. I mean, we're actually seeing project activity increasing in Europe. The value of projects currently under construction has grown about 36% over the past year, increasing from 26 billion in 2025 to about 35.8 billion currently. Now that's significant, and it kind of surprised me. But one of the reasons for this increase, I think, is that projects are staying in the construction phase for longer, as we've seen several delayed startup dates due to financial or market reasons. This includes projects like Stegra's grassroots green steel project in Sweden, which is delayed construction while it looks for additional financing, and Kaliber, which is developing lithium mines and a refinery in Finland, has also staggered its startup dates for its projects. So looking a little deeper at what's under construction, it's dominated by the steel industry projects. The steel industry in Europe is in the midst of a modernization and shift away from coal-based production. This transition has slowed considerably under current economic situation, but still there are notable projects moving forward. SSAB, for example, is electrifying its processes by building new electric arc furnace melt shop in Luleå. Similar projects are planned throughout Europe, and there's another 20 billion in medium and high probability projects scheduled to begin construction over the next 12 months. In my opinion, there are two major themes driving project activity in Europe. They are both related to the electrification and decarbonization efforts that we've been following for some time now. There's an upstream theme around the need to diversify supply chains for critical minerals, starting with mining and refining. And we see the same trend unfolding in the U.S., where resource security is a priority. This is driving a lot of policy decisions being made, impacting mining and downstream refining sectors for critical minerals like copper, lithium, and nickel. And there's another downstream theme around the economic situation, high energy cost and overcapacity issues, which are constraints to some of the more traditional building block metals such as steel and aluminum and other smelting sectors. Now, I'd like to bring in Cemal, who heads up our research in Europe. Hi, Cemal. Overcapacity and high energy costs are severely impacting activity in Europe. Can you explain this?
Yes, this is something we see every day in a lot of heavy industries. Europe simply has more capacity than current demand supports. When demand is weak and capacity is high, margins get squeezed and companies become very careful with new investments. Now add energy costs on top of that. Energy in Europe is structurally more expensive than in many other regions. For energy-intensive industries, electricity and gas costs can make or break a project. So when you put those two things together, it's not surprising that many projects are delayed or scaled down. What we see instead is a focus on efficiency improvements, life extensions, or decarbonization projects that are supported by policy. So the market isn't frozen, but it's much more disciplined and selective.
Okay, so selective projects for core industries and project costs are rising. U.S. tariffs and cheap foreign imports of steel from China and other countries has been noted as one of the problems. This has slowed development of decarbonization projects, and green steel projects involving hydrogen have been scaled back significantly.
Joe, if I could just get you to pause there and go back to that statement you made about pressure on green steel. Obviously, across the board, green hydrogen costs are rising, and that's obviously put a lot of pressure on the downstream buyers of the green hydrogen. Is that one of the main reasons now of pressure on the European steel sector? It's looking to pivot towards production of cleaner end product at a time when the market is still pretty well supported and well supplied with Chinese cheaper steel. Is that one of the big challenges that Europe's seeing right now?
Yeah, it's very expensive to produce green steel, and the electrolysis process, which makes the hydrogen from renewable energy, is expensive, and there's some technological issues around the development that haven't been worked out yet. So we're seeing a lot of those plans being put on hold. Almost all the steelmakers in Europe have plans to electrify, but what they're doing is turning to transition fuels like natural gas to make the direct reduced iron instead of a hydrogen-based, which natural gas can also be used as a reductant there to make the iron. So we're seeing a little bit of a shift right now and delay in a lot of those projects.
And Joe, also steel, cement, all the smelting sectors are very energy intense. Do you see the opportunity for maybe more carbon capture being put and applied to some of these operational smelters and steel mills?
Well, there's definitely a lot of carbon capture projects being developed at cement plants, for example. That's where we're seeing the most development for carbon capture. There's some decarbonization projects like glass manufacturing using electric furnaces there instead of natural gas, which is a predominant fuel in that industry. So yes, we're seeing quite a bit of development there as well. I mentioned the struggles of Stegra earlier, which is a startup green steel project. In an effort to level the playing field, the EU has implemented its own, what is essentially a tariff on imports called CBAM, which went into effect at the beginning of the year. Cemal, can you explain what CBAM is and what its impact is on the market?
CBAM stands for Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, but at its core, it's actually a pretty simple idea. European producers already pay for their carbon emissions. A lot of producers outside Europe don't. CBAM is meant to close that gap. It applies carbon costs to imports like steel, aluminum, cement, and electricity, based on how carbon intensive they are. So if something is produced with high emissions, it becomes more expensive when it comes into the European Union. What's interesting is the impact. It's not just about the price, it's changing behavior. Companies are starting to rethink where they produce, how they produce, and whether investing in cleaner technologies suddenly makes sense sooner than expected. So CBAM is really less about trade barriers and more about reshaping supply chains and investment decisions.
So when you're saying changing behaviors, Cemal, are you seeing more reshoring like we are seeing in the U.S., or is it more about foreign suppliers changing their operations?
That's a good question. I would say it's more about operational adjustments than large-scale reshoring, at least for now. For example, we're seeing steel exporters into Europe, particularly from Turkey and parts of Asia, investing much more in carbon tracking and verification systems. They need reliable emissions data now because without it, their products become less competitive under CBAM. And aluminum exporters from China, India, and the Middle East are increasingly aware that power mix matters. If production is tied to coal-based electricity, that shows up in the carbon intensity and affects pricing into Europe. That is pushing some producers to look at cleaner power sourcing or efficiency upgrades. We are also seeing the shift at the investment level. When companies plan new capacity, whether it is direct reduced iron facility, often referred as DRI, or an aluminum smelter, carbon exposure is now built into the financial model. 5 years ago, that was often secondary. Today, it's central. So it's less about factories moving overnight, more about global producers repositioning themselves to stay competitive in a carbon-priced market.
Okay, so it sounds like it's having an impact on producers outside of the EU for now. So let's discuss another major theme, which critical minerals, which have become a geopolitical hotbed recently. Why is that, and how is it manifested in the EU?
If you look at the energy transition more broadly, critical minerals sit right at the center of it. Batteries, electric vehicles, wind turbines, grid expansion, all of it depends on the materials like lithium, rare earth elements, nickel and copper. The issue is that supply chains are many of these materials are highly concentrated. In some cases, one country dominates mining or processing. That creates obvious geopolitical exposure. In the EU, this has triggered a real shift in thinking. Europe imports most of its critical minerals and often relies heavily on a single supplier. That is increasingly seen as a strategic vulnerability rather than just a trade issue. And that's where the trade policy comes into the picture. The EU-Mercosur agreement, which is a trade deal between the European Union and Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay, was signed recently and is still going through ratification. Part of the rationale is strengthening access to raw materials from South America. Brazil, for example, is a major supplier of iron ore and bauxite, so diversification is clearly part of the strategy. At the same time, the EU is implementing measures like CBAM that tie carbon intensity directly to the market access. So what we are seeing is trade policy, climate policy, and industrial policy becoming tightly connected. That is why critical minerals are no longer just mining topic. They are now central to the competitiveness, supply security, and geopolitics.
Joe, stepping back a little bit, clearly critical minerals and also those rare earth elements as well, they're not ubiquitous. They're heavily concentrated in probably a more select number of countries around the world. Would that be right to say?
Yeah, I would say so.
Where in Europe? I mean, for me as an outsider looking in, Europe doesn't necessarily strike me as one of those big markets where we would see many of these critical metals and minerals. Where in particular are you seeing many of these European projects starting to occur from a geographical perspective? Which countries?
Yeah, it's mainly happening in the Nordics, I think, Sweden and Finland, and they also have cheap hydroelectric power in those countries. Like the U.S., the EU is heavily reliant on imports of critical minerals, especially refined critical minerals. The EU's critical mineral list includes 34 critical minerals. 17 of those have been designated as strategic raw materials because they're deemed more essential for the green and digital transition, as well as for defense and aerospace. Currently, we're tracking about 773 projects, totaling $68 billion for critical mineral projects in Europe. The top 5 countries for project development are Finland, Poland, Spain, Germany, and France, which account for about 2/3 of the total activity. About 50% of these projects fall into the mining sector, and then the remainder fall into the downstream refining and downstream processing. One example of one of those projects is in Poland. It's a joint venture by the name of Ionway, which is a venture between Unicor and PowerCo, is nearing completion of a $1.8 billion lithium-ion battery cathode active material plant. And Fluor is the EPC on that. So that's a good example of the downstream products that they need, which are predominantly produced in China and in other countries.
Now, Joe, unlike rare earth elements, which are very much a elemental definition, right? They're rare. What is the actual definition of critical minerals? Because we've recently seen the US, upgrade or revamp their list, which includes, I think, things like, copper's been placed on their metallurgical coal. So clearly the definition of critical minerals is different for different geographies, different jurisdictions. But how does something get put onto that list?
Well, it's deemed necessary for defense, security reasons, economic reasons, all tied to the electrification and digital transformation. So the difference between the U.S. and the European list is they're actually pretty close when you look at it, because the European list takes light rare earths, which there are several in that, and heavy rare earths, and puts them into two different categories, whereas in the U.S. they're spread out between the 17 rare earth elements. So when you look at it closer, it's actually fairly similar. You've got copper, aluminum, nickel, cobalt, lithium that are all on both lists, so they're very similar. And why that's important is once they are classified as critical, then they're available for funding from government through grants and funding programs through the government. So it's a stepping stone for additional funding and support. Similar to the U.S., the EU is implementing policies to support critical mineral development, most recently announcing the creation of a strategic stockpile. Prior policy included the creation of the Critical Raw Materials Act. Cemal, what is the status of the Critical Raw Materials Act?
The Critical Raw Materials Act is really the EU's way of turning that concern into action. The idea is to secure access to key materials by supporting mining, processing, and recycling inside Europe, and by making it easier for strategic projects to move forward. The framework is now in place and implementation has started. We're beginning to see strategic projects being identified, especially in the Nordic region and parts of Southern and Eastern Europe. That said, this is not a quick fix. Permitting, environmental concerns, public acceptance, and financing all take time. The important point is that the policy direction is now clear. The EU has clearly moved from talking about the problem to actively trying to solve it.
Thanks, Cemal. The European Commission has selected 60 projects for the critical mineral supply. 47 projects are located within Europe and 13 outside of Europe. So these include mining, refining, and recycling projects for a range of critical minerals, including alumina, copper, rare earths, to name a few.
Joe, coming back to the statement you've just made about recycling, bearing in mind that Europe still has a big dependency on imports of many of these critical minerals, do you think we will see an increase in recycling type projects? Do you think because of that supply-demand shortfall, we could see some stimulus or some incentive to move forward with recycling initiatives?
Yeah, we definitely are. We're seeing that all over, especially in Europe. The major smelting and recycling companies have expansion projects going on.
So that brings us to a conclusion. Thank you, gentlemen. Clearly, the downstream steel and non-ferrous metal sectors continue to operate under pressure from high energy costs, global oversupply, intense competition from subsidized foreign producers, and substantial capital investments really needed to transition to greener production methods. We're seeing all of that occurring in tandem and in parallel. Much will reside, therefore, on the policy support remaining intact to help deliver on the energy transition goals and those investments needed to provide the pull-through demand across the critical mineral supply chain. So all that is left for me to say is a couple of big thank yous. First to you, Joe, and Cemal. A very big thanks to you both for sharing your insights and your perspectives today. If any of you've got any further questions about any of the points discussed today, then please do reach out to us via the contact details that you can see here. And finally, a big thanks to all of you who have taken the time out to join us today. I hope we have helped you all better navigate some of the currents of change that we're seeing.